Okay, welcome back. We are going to cover the last block on our timeline here where it says beyond captivity. We're going to do this in 2 sessions. And in this first session, we are going to cover the historical books, okay? That's the books that are going to give us the background and the narrative and the history of what is happening during this time. And those books include Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, and Esther. Okay, so that's what this session is, what we're going to cover, and then in the next one, still in the same block of the timeline, we're going to cover the prophets who spoke during that time, and they are called post-exilic prophets, and that's because it's post-exile, after exile. So if you hear me use that term post-exilic prophets, that's what I'm referring to. But we're going to look at the narratives first in this first session. So let me just set the scene for you and remind you of what's happening with the storyline and with Israel's history. So Babylon was the world power, came and destroyed the southern kingdom, took Judah away in 3 different captivities. Remember, we talked about that first one, Daniel and his friends are taken. Second one is Ezekiel, and the third one, Jeremiah, is there for him. And then Jerusalem is completely wiped out. Jeremiah gave a promise. God, through Jeremiah, gave his people a promise that yes, exile is going to happen, but there is a limit. It will be for 70 years, and then you will be allowed to return to the land. So there's this promise. And so the people go into exile, 70 years happen, like Jeremiah predicted, and then we see that King Cyrus allows the people of God to return home if they want to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild. He has a different strategy. Whereas Babylon took people away from their homes, Cyrus is saying, let them all go back and worship their own gods. And then, so this is his strategy for ruling his people. So he allows the people to go back. Now, not everybody went back. Like, yes, they were allowed, but some people went back, but not everybody. And so we don't necessarily know why. I'm sure there's many reasons why people stayed and why they went back. With the group going back, I'm sure you've got a group of people who remember. They've been holding on to the promise, they remember Jerusalem, and they are wanting to go back and restore and rebuild. I'm sure you've got maybe like idealistic youth they haven't been there, they don't know, but they're ready to go and do something great. Maybe you've got some people who they've made a mess of their lives and they just want to start over. I don't know, but I'm sure you have the whole gamut of people that are choosing to return. Well, they get back to the land, and what we're going to see as we look at these books, they are very disappointed. It is not what they thought it was going to be. It's a trash heap. There's opposition everywhere they look. It's not at all what they expected, and they very quickly get disillusioned and disappointed and grow quite apathetic. And so really that's the background and then these books are going to tell the story of that. But I want you to bear that in mind, and I also want you to think about what the prophets before the exile, what they were promising. When they were saying, okay, you've sinned, you've left God with no choice, he's going to judge you, but that's not the end of the story, and restoration was promised. Well, the things that they're holding on to in their heart is a messianic hope, that a Messiah is going to come, that the temple would be rebuilt, that because God promised this in the prophets, that God would dwell again with his people, that all the nations would come and worship the Lord in this new temple. And so be thinking that those are the promises they're holding in their mind, and then they get back to the land, and none of that is happening. And they're looking around and they're thinking, this can't possibly be it. All right? So be thinking about that as we walk through their history. So first book we're going to cover, Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, just like 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel, was actually originally one book. So it's meant to be, we're going to cover it as one book. Okay? Title for the book of Chronicles: Israel's history through the priest's perspective. Israel's history through the priest's perspective. Now listen, do you remember me telling you before with Kings that it was their history through the prophet's perspective? And the prophets were concerned with how they followed the law. Did they follow the covenant or not, each king? Now, the focus of the author of Chronicles is different, okay? He is coming as a priest's perspective. And as a priest, he is concerned with the temple and with the worship of God. And so he's going to look at each king and how did they treat the temple of God? Okay, so he has a different perspective and a different point in going back through their history. All right, so we're going to talk about that point in a moment, but first of all, who is our author? That can help us understand what the point is that he's trying to make. Remember, I said it's written from a priestly perspective, and it would have had to have been written post-exile, because we get the exile recorded at the end of the book, so he had to have written it after the fact, okay? So if you look closely at the way Chronicles ends and the way the book of Ezra begins, it actually appears to be a direct continuation. We know that Ezra was a teaching priest and that he was a scribe, which means he would be writing these accounts down. And so with all of that in mind, and also looking at who history gives account to being the author of this book, we think that Ezra, the same Ezra in the book of Ezra, is also the author of the book of Chronicles. Okay? Now, that is going to help you understand, because you're going to understand who he is and what his hope for and what his heart was for the people. So then when you see the history he's writing, it's like, oh, that's why he's writing this history. Okay? He was one of the main people who were helping bring moral revival, spiritual revival to the people who had returned to the land. So he cares about their spiritual state, and he's a priest. And so he has every incentive to write this history and help them understand how they got to where they're at. The book starts from David all the way through the decree of Cyrus, which would be about 470 years that's being covered. So we've got a lot of ground, a lot of history that's being covered in this book. It's the emphasis of the book is on David and Solomon's covenant loyalty as models for the time of restoration. And what I mean by that is like how they were loyal to God, and that should be the model of these people. Now that they're living in the land, Ezra's holding up David and Solomon, how they treated the temple, and saying, well, this is what we need to be like. And what is interesting, because we have the account in Kings, he doesn't mention any of David or Solomon's sins. We only see the positive side of their kingship. And it's because of the point he's making with the book, that he has to know, the people know, it's recorded in the book of Kings. They know about the sin of these kings, but he doesn't record it. And I think it's because his purpose is, let's look at how they treated the temple, and we're going to look at that as our model for kings and for how we should be treating the temple. Also, the emphasis of the book, the central role of the temple and worship for restoration. If they're going to be restored as a people, they need to have the temple rebuilt, and they need to be worshiping God together. That true worship is a matter of the heart, and then also blessing and rest for obedience, and judgment for disobedience, which is the same thing that the law has always said, and that the prophets have been speaking for now hundreds of years at this point. You're going to notice as you read through this book that the main focus is the Davidic line, David's line, and the temple. He doesn't actually give us the history of the northern kingdom. He's only focused on David's line and the southern kingdom and how they treated the temple. And it's because he's trying to help his audience, his readers, his people to realize we've got to get it right this time in the way that we worship. It is not a matter of mere ritual. We cannot just go through the motions like our ancestors did. There's a repeated phrase of your heart, to devote their heart and soul to seeking the Lord your God. And so you see this emphasis of this has to be real, guys. It's got to come from your heart, and trying to help them see that through their history. Okay, so the point in time that they're writing, that this is being writing, it's from this perspective of trying to start over, trying to rebuild. And so he wants to start over with a clear understanding of what is important to God. And that when Judah, the southern kingdom, was successful in the past, it was because they were walking with God and they were obeying him, and their kings were honoring him and honoring the temple. The basic way that the structure of the book, of the two books, you have genealogies, which is a list of who came back to the land and who went, that type of thing, okay? It's very important to them. They want to know where they came from. I know it can be boring for us to read through, but for the original reader, wanting to have a place and a purpose and knowing who they are and where they came from, genealogies would be very important to them. So chapters 1 through 9 of 1 Chronicles is genealogies. Then in 1 Chronicles 10 through 2 Chronicles 9, it's the story of the monarchy, the united monarchy under David and Solomon. So we actually have quite a big narrative of David and Solomon in the book of Chronicles. And it's really concerning the positive things in their life. And like I said, they leave out the negative, and I think it's because of the purpose that he's not trying to hide it. He knows people can access it and read about it, but that's not the purpose of his book. It's focusing more on the temple and correct worship, and that's the obvious focus of this section when he looks at David and when he looks at Solomon. Okay, so genealogies, then the united monarchy, and then in 2 Chronicles 10 through 26, we have the story of the kings of Judah. And like I said, it's only Judah. He doesn't give, whereas Kings kind of goes side by side, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and goes through their history. He's only concerned with the southern kingdom kings here, okay? And the idea would be for them, these later generations, to learn from these stories. Yeah, I think and then the readers who are in exile or now returning from the land, and they're still kind of wondering, like, does God care about us anymore? By looking at this history, the answer is yes. He cares. He cares about you. He cares about how you worship, and it matters. And so the author is trying to get that point across. For a redemptive plan, I'm going to read another quote from How to Read the Bible, book by book. Sometimes the way they word it is just so good that I can't word it any better than this, so I'm just going to give you the direct quote. It says, "By this retelling of the story of God's people, Chronicles reminds us of the central role of worship. For the readers of the New Testament, it also points forward to the one whose own cleansing of the temple and death and resurrection replaced the temple as the place of God's presence." Okay, so by talking about this, about the temple and the cleansing of the temple and how it's pointing us ahead to Jesus and to what he does for us. Character and nature of God, he wants our hearts and our worship. Remember, the author is trying to say he is not after mere ritual, and you strayed so far from the Lord before when you made it about ritual. He wants your heart. He wants true worship. And then timeless truth, God wants true worship from the heart, not mere ritual from us today. I don't think he cares about us going through the motions. I think I know that he doesn't, based on the way he speaks to Israel through the prophets when he says things like, I despise your festivals. I don't want that. I want your heart. And so, timeless truth, God wants true worship from the heart, not mere ritual. Okay, so Book of Chronicles, taking us all through the history of the kings right up until exile. Now, remember I told you, if Ezra's the author of this book, kind of goes right into the next part of the story. Now, we're at Ezra and Nehemiah. And you'll notice I put those two books together. And that's because originally they were one book. They're telling one story. It's not two separate books, though the main character in the books, shift, but it's Ezra who wrote both of them, okay? So a title for these two books, you can put together as one, are Return and Rebuild Amongst Opposition. Return and Rebuild Amongst Opposition. Now, remember that I'm telling you how these are what we call historical narratives. So this is giving us the background of what happened and the events of post-exile, of coming back into the land. And so we're going to get a recording of what happened during this time, okay? So main idea of this book is rebuilding and reform in post-exilic Judah. Remember, post-exilic means after exile. From about 539 or 38 is the first return, and especially from 458 to 430, which is during the reign of Artaxerxes of Persia. Okay, I'm going to have some of this on the timeline for you. What's being emphasized in these two books is successful completion of the temple and the walls, even though there's opposition. So keep building. Let's get this temple rebuilt. The crisis of intermarriage and national identity. Covenant renewal and reform. And all of this among the exiles who had just returned to Jerusalem. Okay, that's the focus of the emphasis of the book. Now, I told you he's recording the story of Jewish reform between 458 and 430. And this reform includes rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem, which is giving a definition to the place of God's people. It not only keeps people out, but it gives them an identity and a place. And that is part of why it's so important that they rebuild these walls. And then, yeah, it's telling the story of Jewish reform, the rebuilding of the walls, rebuilding of the temple, repentance, and a covenant renewal ceremony, which is when they come together and they read the book of the law together. I want to make sure you understand and you have in your mind these dates, because again, it's going to help you understanding just the whole story, and then also when we see what the prophets were writing into, what the events were, okay? So there's 3 returns. I've talked about how there was 3 exiles, 3 different times that Babylon came and took people away. Well, when they go back to the land, it happens in 3 shifts, okay? First return, you can write this down. It's under Zerubbabel in 539, and this is when the temple would have been rebuilt, okay? There were 42,360 people in this first return. So this was the biggest wave that comes, okay? 539, the first one. The second one is under Ezra in 458, and this is when the people are rebuilt. Ezra's turning their hearts back to God. There was actually 81 years between these 2 returns, and only about 5,000 people come back with Ezra. And then the third return is under Nehemiah in 444, about 14 years after Ezra came with his group, and his focus is on rebuilding the wall and the people, and only a few returned with this return, okay? So it started with about 42,000, then about 5,000, and then not that many with Nehemiah, okay? Now, structure of the book, just so, it's not a hard book to understand, it's just a narrative, so you can read through it and you can understand it, but I just want to kind of make sure you understand the breakdown of it. Ezra 1 through 6 focuses on Zerubbabel. Okay, he leads a large group of people back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. That's the first 6 chapters. Then Ezra 7 through 10, it's about 60 years later, Ezra arrives in Jerusalem to teach the law and to rebuild the community. That's Ezra 7 through 10. And then the book of Nehemiah 1 through 17, Nehemiah is now the main focus, and it's about him leading the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls, okay? And so I think that should help you with understanding just kind of the history and the structure and what's being looked at. Each leader's story begins with a Persian leader, the main world power. Persia, I told you that Cyrus is the one who let the people of God come back to Jerusalem. Then Persia has come in and taken over Babylon. So now Persia is the main world power. Persia, so every leader, Zerubbabel, Nehemiah, and Ezra, each of their stories begins with a Persian leader being moved by God to send the leader back, okay? And then each leader's story, with each leader encounters opposition in their efforts to rebuild. So you see some patterns and structure in the book, okay? Remember what the people were hoping for, what the prophets predicted, what they promised was going to happen one day. This messianic king, that the temple was going to be rebuilt and God would dwell with his people, that the nations would come from all over and worship the Lord. And be thinking about these promises when you read in the account of the temple finally being rebuilt. Some people are crying out for joy, but many of the older people who remember the past temple are weeping because they're thinking, this is not good. This is nothing like what we thought it would be. And you can imagine the disappointment because they have this beautiful messianic hope, and it's clear that this cannot be it. This is not good. And so the people are disappointed, but it's also showing that there's got to be something more that God is up to, because this is not what he promised, all right? Okay, so just looking at the story here, when you think about God's redemptive plan, you can be thinking, how in the world does this fit in with the rest of the narrative of the Bible? Because the book starts with raising our hopes for a temple and a Messiah and the kingdom of God, but then none of that happens. The book kind of just ends. The people are back in the land physically, but the spiritual state of the people seems to be unchanged. The political reforms, the social reforms, the religious reforms don't seem to actually be affecting the heart of the people. And so I think what it's leaving us with is this thought of like God's people, they need a holistic transformation, and it's not going to come from something physical. It's not going to come from the outside. The problem is so much deeper. So I think it's pointing ahead, leaving us to wonder, how is God going to fulfill his covenant promises? But it actually does propel the biblical story forward, because we're kind of left wondering that we have all these promises. We know what God said he would do. It's not happening. So how is he going to do that? And so we're kind of left in this tension, but it actually still is pointing us ahead to the Lord. All right. So under God's redemptive plan, you can write, pushes the narrative along by leaving us to wonder, what is God going to do to fulfill his covenant promises? Okay. Character and nature. There's a verse in Nehemiah 9:32, and it actually lists out a bunch of things of God's character and nature. I'm going to say a few of them. I want you to just pick one of those, okay? But it says that he's great and mighty, he's covenant keeping, steadfast love, he's righteous, he's faithful. And so there's this list right in there in Nehemiah 9:32 that's just declaring the character and nature of God. Then a timeless truth for these two books. While you're facing opposition, entrust yourself to a faithful creator and continue to endure. While facing opposition, entrust yourself to a faithful creator and continue to endure. I'm sure all of us can think of times in our life where we're facing any form of opposition. Do we take matters into our own hands? Do we try to do it ourselves? Do we give up? No, we trust ourselves, knowing our creator is good, and we continue to endure. Okay? That's Ezra and Nehemiah. And now, last of the historical books that's giving us the background of what's happening during this post-exilic time is the book of Esther, which I imagine most of you are familiar with. Pretty basic Bible story that most of us have read, and it's really easy to read, so you can go through and you can read it. A title for this book, Trusting the Sovereign God in the Midst of a Pagan Culture. Trusting the Sovereign God in the midst of a pagan culture. Now, this is happening during the days, we see right in chapter 1, verse 1, it's during the days of Ahasuerus or Xerxes, okay? We know that he's the king of Persia. So just to make sure you understand, we had Assyria, they took away the northern kingdom, they were the major world power. Then Babylon comes in, it's even bigger, and it takes away Assyria, and it's also Babylon that takes the southern kingdom into exile. Now the next world power that comes is Persia. They take over Babylon, and it's Persia that we had just read about that allowed the God's people to return to the land. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a few Persian kings to catch you up, and so you understand the history and where we're at, okay? So King Cyrus, he's the one who allowed God's people to return to the land. He conquered Babylon in 539. There's a story about how he actually dried up and diverted the Euphrates River and walked in on a dry riverbed to take over the city. So that's Cyrus. He died in battle in 530. Next Persian king was Cambyses from 530 to 522. He conquered Egypt in 525, but when he received bad news about some revolts in Persia, he went back, and he actually, in jumping off his horse, he stabbed himself in the leg with his own sword and got gangrene and died from that. And then we have Darius the Great, 522 to 486. He's one of the strongest Persian monarchs. He believed in exerting total control in his kingdom. He was efficient. He had this efficiency and organization that made Persia a centralized state. So he was a really strong leader, but also really feared because he did not take opposition lightly. He squashed revolts as soon as they happened. And then we have Xerxes, 486 to 465. And that is no doubt that Ahasuerus is King Xerxes. Okay, so that is who is the king in the book of Esther. All right. So the main audience now that we have in the book of Esther, and what we're being told about, is actually what happens amongst God's people, the ones who stayed in the land, the ones who stayed in exile. They're still in Persia. Okay, these are the ones who did not return to rebuild the temple, and they just continue to live their lives in the land under the Persian Empire. Okay, so that is who who is being addressed, Esther and Mordecai, they're living in Persia, not in Jerusalem, and the Jews around, okay? So, and think about, many of the people probably have adapted to Babylonian and Persian culture. They're comfortable, they built their lives there, so they decided to stay in the land. This has been about 100 years now since they were initially exiled and taken out of their city, okay? So it's been about 100 years of living this way, so they're quite adapted to the culture, I'm sure. Probably our original reader to the book of Esther, they would be Jews living in Persia. Maybe they're not totally sure what to make of God and his feelings towards them. Maybe they're questioning his might and his strength, because the Jews are not a major world power by any stretch of the imagination. The Persians are ruling. They're just this little tiny people group, and maybe they're thinking, is he still with us? Is he in control? Is he more powerful? Is he as powerful as the gods the Persians serve? Because Persia seems to be a lot more powerful than us. So is he able to do anything? These are the kind of questions. Does he care about us anymore? Maybe he can't do anything about the king of Persia. He's the most powerful man in the world. Maybe that's just too much for him. They could be asking those questions. Then we get this story of a little Jewish girl that God that wins the heart of the great and mighty King Ahasuerus. And you know that all the readers know who this is. They know who the king is. And they're reading this story of like, what? A little Jewish girl rises up to become the queen of Persia? And surely they're going to be shocked by, whoa, how is this possible? How did this happen? And it would start to answer the question, could it be that God has not overlooked us? Could it be that he actually is in control? Could it be that he's actually more powerful than this mighty king of Persia? Could it be that he didn't turn his back on them? That he hasn't totally forsaken them? And so I think this story would start to spark a hope and a reminder that they are God's people and their God is Almighty God and in control of all things. So just briefly, because I think you can understand the story pretty well for yourself, but there's two players in this drama that you can focus on. There's Mordecai and Esther. And I want you to appreciate the weight of the situation that they're finding themselves in. You have to remember, they live amongst a pagan nation. They are not surrounded by people who worship God. They are surrounded by people who are hostile to them and to their faith, and they have been their whole lives. They're born in exile. They've never known what it's like to live in Jerusalem or live near the temple or live among a people who identify themselves as God's people. But as you read through the story, you find so many clues to see what they really valued, that they had held on. They lived faithfully in the midst of this pagan culture, and they did love the Lord. You see with Mordecai, he's a man that lives according to the law. He exhibits godly character and values. He's taking care of his orphaned niece. You can see that he's living according to the values of the covenant. He stands for God in the midst of an ungodly culture. He does have an understanding of God's sovereignty, because remember, he tells Esther, if you don't do this, God's going to save his people either way. But you have a chance to be a part of this. No matter what, God is going to do what he's going to do. So he has this understanding of God's sovereignty, and he knows who holds his life in his hands, and that it's not this evil Haman that's after him. And then with Esther, we see that she has this wisdom and humility beyond her years. We know she's a woman that's familiar with pain and heartache. Though she's been risen up, she's also an orphan, and was forced into a harem of the king. Like, this would not have been an easy life. She honors her authorities, and maybe that shows even a familiarity with the law. And then she also, you see this trust in God's sovereignty in the midst of a pagan culture, when she says, get everyone to fast and pray, and if I perish, I perish. And so she's trusting herself to God. So we have this really beautiful picture of two people choosing to align themselves with and trust God in the midst of their pagan culture. Now, one thing, I don't know if you've noticed, the name God is actually never mentioned in the book of Esther, but he's clearly the whole point of the story, and his sovereignty, that he's in control. You're meant to read the narrative and see that for yourself. Even without his name being mentioned, you see the sovereign God acting on behalf of his people, and that he truly is the one that's ultimately in control. So for God's redemptive plan, we see the preservation of his people in this book, because this guy Haman was planning on wiping out the entire Jewish people. And so you see God's sovereignty, his power, the preservation of his people, because it's through his people that the Messiah will come. For God's character and nature, his name is never mentioned, but his sovereignty is the point of this book. And then for our timeless truth. The obvious point here is that as Christians, we need to stand for truth in the midst of our pagan cultures. We're also surrounded by cultures that do not worship God, but that does not mean that we aren't responsible to stand for truth and to live for truth and to endure and to trust ourselves to our Creator. Okay, so those are the historical books. And now we're gonna pause this, and we'll have another session on the prophetic books, the prophets who speak during this time that I just covered. All right, we're at the part of the session where we are gonna talk about what this looks like in our life. We want it to mean something. We want it to translate into real life. So let's take the timeless truth from Chronicles that says God is after our worship. He is not after mere ritual. I want to talk about that. He wants our hearts, I think is how we said it. God's after our hearts, true worship, not mere ritual. So first thing I want to point out, think about what you've seen so far in the Old Testament. Even in the Old Testament, even with the law and the sacrificial system and all of this ritual, God was after his people's hearts. He always has been. He's never wanted just kind of going through the motions and the ritual part. That's how his people ended up so far away from them. They would go through the motions, they'd do the things they thought they were supposed to do. Meanwhile, they'd go off and worship other gods. And so in our lives, we need to think about this, all right? Like what I think happens is this disconnect that all of us are prone to, probably guilty of. And what I mean by that is the disconnect of coming to church, going through the motions, singing the songs, doing the right things, fulfilling people's expectations of us, and then turning around and doing what we want. You know, Sunday mornings we come and worship, and the rest of the week, God's nowhere to be seen. Doing what's right in our own eyes, not living for him, outright sinning. That's what I mean by that disconnect. God could care less about you coming on Sunday morning and worshiping him if you're not connecting that to your life, if it doesn't mean anything, if it doesn't change you, if it's not coming from a heart of adoration and worship to the Lord. So I want you to think about that, because you're young and you can be a part of the problem or you can be a part of the solution in the church and the community that you're a part of. We all know what it's like when you're around inauthentic Christians that are dried up spiritually, that actually don't love the Lord. They just are going through ritual. That's not attractive to anybody. But when Christians are worshiping from their heart, when they're loving the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving their neighbor as their self, when it means something to them, when it's coming from an authentic place from them, a conviction in their hearts, then there's life, and it's so attractive to all who see it. And that's what I want for you guys. That's what I want for me and my community, for us to be worshiping God from the heart. All right, so let this rebuke you. If you are one of those people who are coming to youth group and talking the talk and walking the walk, well, talking the talk and not walking the walk, and then turning around and partying on Friday nights or whatever, or outright sinning, or maybe you've been a Christian your whole life. You know exactly what your parents and your church expects from you, and you go and you do the right thing and you get lots of attention for it, but your heart is a million miles away. Please let this rebuke you. Let it drive you into God's presence and to your knees in repentance, all right? And then let it heal you, because do you want to know something? When you start to worship from the heart, when you start to mean the words you're singing, when you start to slow down and just let your heart fill with worship, there is such healing, there's such life, there's such peace, there's such joy, because all of a sudden your eyes are off of yourself and you're doing what you were created to do. And I promise you, you are going to see a difference and a healing in your heart when you start treating God's presence like this and learning to love his presence. The other thing is, how does this equip you? Now you know
first of all, that that's what he wants, right? He wants true worship. I want to tell you something that that I tell my younger kids even, right? We have family devotions, and it's definitely easy for them and me even sometimes to just go through the motions. And I don't want that for any of us. And so what we talk about is we slow down and we start declaring what we know to be true about God, thinking about God, worshiping Him. We warm our hearts hot. We get our hearts hot with worship. We start saying these things we know to be true until our heart starts to fill with joy, until we start to mean them. And then all of a sudden the worship flows out of that. So now you're equipped. Worship your hearts hot. Don't just go through the motions saying, Lord, I know you love me. I know you're good. I know you died on the cross for me. Keep going until the joy comes. Keep leaning in. Keep declaring all the things you're learning about His character and His nature until your heart starts to get hot with worship. And then it's real, and it's coming from a real place. And you'll start to see growth and life and peace. And that is so what I want for all of us.